Have you ever wanted something so badly, only to feel empty once you had it? A person, an experience, a pleasure. For a moment, it fills you with excitement, like rain on parched earth. But soon, the thirst returns. This is the nature of lust. It promises to heal our emptiness, but ends up feeding it. Like a fire that burns brighter the more we feed it, lust is not satisfied by fulfillment, it grows stronger. In today's world, we are surrounded by images, sounds, and invitations that stir our most primal instincts. Social media algorithms learn what arouses us. Advertising is built on seduction. Entertainment is laced with desire. Even casual conversations can carry subtle cues of flirtation, admiration, or longing. And in the midst of it all, we are told that desire is life. That wanting more is natural. That fulfilling our desires is the way to happiness. But what if it's the opposite? What if lust, that burning ache to possess, consume, and be consumed, is not the path to joy, but to suffering? The Buddha called this craving ta, a thirst that never ends. It manifests in many forms: thirst for sensual pleasure, for existence, for non-existence. But sensual craving, kamata, is perhaps the most seductive. Because it hides beneath the promise of intimacy. It wears the mask of connection. But beneath it all, it's a hunger, not for love, but for stimulation. Not to give, but to take. Many people mistake lust for love. But lust says, I want you because you make me feel good. Love says, I want you to be free, even if I'm not part of that freedom. Lust grasps. Love lets go. And in that difference lies the entire path from suffering to awakening. As we begin this journey together, I invite you not to feel ashamed of your desire. That is not the way of Buddhism. The Buddha never condemned human longing, he simply understood it deeply. He knew that all beings crave pleasure because they are trying to escape suffering. But when we chase pleasure without understanding the roots of our pain, we end up more lost, more fragmented, more hollow than before. So ask yourself gently, not with judgment but with awareness. What am I truly hungry for? Is it the person I crave, or the feeling I think they'll give me? Am I drawn to beauty, or to the illusion of completion it promises? When we look honestly, we may find that beneath our lust is loneliness, or fear, or the deep wound of not feeling enough. Lust is clever. It doesn't announce itself as insecurity. It dresses itself as confidence, as passion, as ambition. But it is born from a place that whispers, I am not whole. I need something outside myself to feel complete. And so we chase. We scroll. We fantasize. We pursue lovers, or objects, or fleeting highs. And for a moment, it works. For a moment, we are relieved from our inner ache. But then, it returns. And we need more, and more, until our lives become centered around chasing rather than being. In Buddhism, this cycle is known as samsara, the endless wandering from desire to desire, lifetime to lifetime. We are not punished by our cravings, we are trapped by them. And the trap is not held by someone else, we are the ones clinging to the bars. But there is a path out. Not by suppressing desire, not by pretending we are above it, but by understanding it, sitting with it, seeing it not as an enemy, but as a teacher. What is this craving pointing to? What is the wound beneath the want? In this teaching, we are not asked to kill desire. We are asked to see through it, to look beyond the surface of lust and ask, what am I really seeking? And so we begin, not by turning away, but by turning inward. not with fear, but with honesty. Because if we can understand the hunger, we can learn to feed it with wisdom, not craving. With awareness, not impulse. This is not a quit path, but it is a liberating one. And it starts with a willingness to see that maybe, just maybe, lust hurts more than it heals. We use the word lust so easily, so casually. It's in songs, movies, jokes, sometimes even praised as confidence or charm. But what is lust, really? In the Buddhist path, clarity begins with naming things accurately. We don't rush to judge or suppress. We look directly, gently, truthfully. So let us begin with this. Lust is not love. Lust is not connection. Lust is not joy. Lust is a form of craving, a powerful, sometimes overwhelming desire that wants to consume. It is the longing not just to experience, but to possess, to merge, to conquer. It arises in the body, yes, a tightening in a chest, a heat in the belly, but its roots are deeper than the flesh. Lust is the mind reaching outward, grasping at something it believes will complete it. The Pali word raga, often translated as lust or passion, carries the connotation of coloring or staining the mind. It's like pouring red dye into clear water. Everything becomes tinted. Perception narrows. We stop seeing a person as a full being and start seeing only what we want from them. Their joy, their pain, their freedom, all vanish beneath our need. And this is where the danger begins. Lust turns people into objects, bodies into targets, encounters into transactions. Even when wrapped in beautiful words or romantic stories, lust operates with one goal: satisfaction of the self. But here's the paradox: the self it's trying to satisfy doesn't actually exist. In Buddhism, we are taught that the self is not a fixed thing, but a process, a bundle of sensations, thoughts, feelings, and perceptions constantly arising and fading. So when we lust after something, what we are really doing is trying to stabilize the unstable, to anchor the shifting tides of our experience by grabbing onto something solid, a body, a fantasy, a moment. But that solidity is an illusion. No pleasure can last. No body can remain unchanged. No fantasy can deliver permanent peace. And when reality reasserts itself, as it always does, we feel betrayed, hurt, abandoned, and we blame the other person, or ourselves, or love itself. But the root of the hurt was never in the person or the act. It was in the illusion that lust sold us. This will finally be enough. To make this clearer, let's distinguish lust from other experiences that are often confused with it. Lust is not love. Love sees the other as a whole being. Lust sees only the parts that excite. Love listens. Lust projects. Love accepts. Lust demands. Lust is not beauty. Beauty can inspire awe, stillness, reverence. But lust turns beauty into possession. Beauty, in its purest form, invites us to pause. Lust makes us rush. Lust is not joy. Joy is expansive. Lust is narrowing. Joy opens the heart. Lust contracts it into want, urgency, need. So why is lust so powerful? Why does it take hold of us so easily? Because it's fast, immediate. It offers the illusion of escape from boredom, from loneliness, from fear. In a single glance, a single message, a single touch, we feel alive, needed, desired. And for a moment, we believe that this is real connection, that this is what we were searching for. But that's the trap. Lust does not want stillness. It doesn't want truth. It thrives in fantasy. And when the fantasy breaks, so does the illusion of connection. This is why so many people feel hollow after a lustful encounter. Why even relationships built on intense chemistry often collapse. Because chemistry is not compatibility. Passion is not peace. And lust is not love. The Buddha taught that the path to liberation begins with right view, seeing things as they are, not as we want them to be. And when we look at lust clearly, without shame or indulgence, we begin to see its mechanics, its rise and fall, its promises and its consequences. We begin to recognize how often we are not in control, how our thoughts, our actions, our speech are driven by impulses that have nothing to do with wisdom or compassion. We see how many decisions we've made, small and large, under the influence of desire, and how often those decisions brought regret. But this recognition is not cause for guilt. It's cause for awakening. Because once we see clearly, we can begin to choose. Not out of fear, not out of repression, but out of wisdom, out of kindness. We can begin to ask, is this desire leading to connection or confusion? Is this that coming from love or lack? Is this feeling rooted in freedom or in fear of being alone? When we inquire deeply like this, lust begins to lose its grip. Not because we are fighting it, but because we are understanding it. And when we understand, we don't have to be ruled by it. We become free not from desire, but within desire, able to feel it without being consumed, to acknowledge it without acting blindly, to ride its wave without drowning. And that, my friend, is the beginning of liberation. Have you ever chased a feeling, caught it, and yet, moments later, felt more lost than before? That fleeting satisfaction, that high of possession or pleasure, which quickly slips through your fingers like sand. This is the cycle of lust, not simply its nature, but its trap. It gives the illusion of fulfillment while secretly feeding deeper hunger. In Buddhist thought, this cycle is described as vitalsya, distortion. The mind, clouded by desire, sees impermanence as permanence, suffering as pleasure, and the non-self as self. Lust is one of the strongest engines of this distortion. It whispers, if I just have this one thing, then I'll be whole. But the moment we grasp it, the illusion begins to fade. What we call fulfillment in lust is not true peace. It is a peak, intense, exhilarating, but that cannot be sustained. The body cannot remain in a state of arousal forever. The mind cannot stay intoxicated. The heart cannot feel possessed and free at the same time. So the experience collapses. And with it, we are left not just empty, but often ashamed, disillusioned, or addicted. But here's the subtle cruelty of lust. It doesn't leave us in that emptiness. It seduces us again. It says, no, that wasn't the right person, the right moment, the right fantasy. Try again. Just one more time. And so we do. Again and again. The Buddha called this cycle tanhata nabhava. Craving leads to clinging, which leads to becoming. We crave something, we cling to the idea or the object, and then we shape our identity around it. We become the one who needs this to be complete. But no matter how much we get, more partners, more experiences, more stimulation, we are never truly full. Because lust, by its very nature, is a thirst that cannot be quenched. Let's imagine this through a simple metaphor. Picture a man walking in the desert. He is dying of thirst. Ahead of him, he sees a beautiful oasis, cool water, palm trees, shade. He runs toward it, desperate. But when he arrives, it vanishes. It was only a mirage. This is what modern desire often is. A mirage projected by the mind onto bodies, moments, images. The person we lust after becomes the oasis. But we are not seeing them. We are seeing what we think they will give us: validation, ecstasy, escape. And when the person turns out to be human, flawed, limited, transient, we either blame them or move on to the next mirage. This is why so many modern relationships feel unsatisfying. They begin with intensity but collapse under the weight of expectation. Because when lust is the foundation, we are not building on truth. We are building on projection. Real fulfillment, the kind the Buddha spoke of, does not come from satisfying every desire. It comes from understanding desire's nature, seeing it clearly, watching it rise and fall without being swept away. This is not about becoming cold or numb. On the contrary, it's about becoming alive in a deeper way. When we no longer expect others to fill our inner voids, we begin to meet them as they truly are. Without the haze of longing, we can see with the eyes of compassion, not consumption. And slowly, something changes inside us. We stop chasing intensity and start welcoming intimacy. We stop needing to possess and begin learning to be present. We stop asking, "What can I get?" and begin wondering, "How can I love without clinging?" This shift, subtle but profound, is the beginning of spiritual maturity. It is the moment we realize fulfillment is not something we hunt for in the world. It is something we uncover in the silence of our own presence. But this requires courage, because it means giving up the fantasy that something out there will finally make us whole. It means facing our own emptiness, not to be ashamed of it, but to understand it, to touch it gently, to learn that this emptiness is not a flaw, but the spaciousness where real peace can arise. In Zen, there's a saying, "Nothing is missing." Lust says, "You are not enough. You need more." Wisdom says, "You are whole." Sit quietly and see. So the next time you feel that pull, that rush of craving, that ache of want, pause. Breathe it. Don't rush to fulfill it. Just look. Not with judgment, with curiosity, with compassion. Ask, what am I trying to fill? What if I didn't reach outward right now, but turned inward instead? What would I find if I sat with this hunger, without feeding it? You might be surprised. The ache may soften. The need may dissolve. And in that stillness, you may realize that what you thought was fulfillment was only a shadow of the peace that comes when we no longer need anything to feel complete. That is the liberation the Buddha offered. Not the fleeting pleasure of fulfilled lust, but the lasting joy of an unburdened heart. Before he was the Buddha, he was Siddhartha, a prince, a seeker, a man like any other. He knew pleasure. He had a palace filled with beauty, music, comfort, and lovers. But the story of the Buddha is not a story of indulgence, it is a story of waking up. And to awaken, Siddhartha had to meet the very force we are exploring today, desire. Not once, but again and again. One of the most powerful moments in his journey happened beneath a Bodhi tree, the sacred site of his enlightenment. There, seated in unwavering stillness, Siddhartha was attacked not by weapons, but by delusions. Mra, the tempter, the personification of delusion and ego, appeared. He did not come with physical chains. He came with fear, pride, doubt, and desire. Mra sent his daughters, radiant and seductive, to dance before Siddhartha. They embodied all the sensual temptations of the world: beauty, pleasure, ecstasy, distraction. They whispered, "Why suffer when you can enjoy? Why renounce what the world offers? You deserve to feel alive. Take it." But Siddhartha did not look away. He did not fight. He did not shame the images. He simply saw, clearly, calmly, and that clarity, that unwavering presence, made their power dissolve. This is one of the great teachings of Buddhism. Clarity is stronger than suppression. Awareness is more powerful than avoidance. The Buddha did not win by denying desire existed. He won by seeing its true nature. He saw that these forms, however beautiful, were impermanent. That the pleasure they promised was fleeting. That their power was only as strong as his belief in their promise. This is why Mara failed. Not because the temptations weren't strong, but because the mind of the Buddha was unmoved. That same Mara visits us every day. Not with daughters in flowing robes, but through phone screens, passing glances, old memories, fantasies in a night. And like Siddhartha, we too are tested. Will we grasp at the image? Or will we see through the illusion? In this story, the daughters of Mara are just mythical figures. They are symbols. They represent the internal patterns that seduce us. The belief that pleasure equals happiness. The habit of escaping discomfort through stimulation. The false hope that something outside will complete what feels broken inside. But let's look closer. Siddhartha was not repressing desire. He was transforming his relationship to it. He didn't sit in hatred. He sat in knowing. And this knowing made him free. This is crucial. Buddhism does not teach that desire is evil. It teaches that unexamined desire causes suffering. It's not lust itself that harms. It's the clinging, the identifying, the chasing without awareness. When you see a beautiful person and feel desire, that in itself is not a problem. The mind responds to form. This is natural. But what happens next? Do you get lost in fantasy? Do you start grasping, scheming, attaching? Or do you observe the sensation, the thought, the wave, and let it pass? That is the path of the Buddha, not suppression, but liberation through awareness. And even after enlightenment, Mara continued to visit the Buddha. Yes, even after awakening, the old patterns arose. But the Buddha would gently say, "I see you, Mara." And that was enough. Awareness became a sanctuary. Can we do the same? The next time lust arises, instead of rushing to act or to run, pause. Say quietly, "I see you." Don't judge. Don't indulge. Just see. And like Mara's daughters, the illusion begins to lose its hold. Because what we see clearly, we are no longer controlled by. There is a quiet power in stillness. Beneath that tree, Siddhartha didn't resist. He remained present. And presence, true presence, is the most powerful antidote to desire's deception. So what does this teach us? It teaches us that we don't need to fight lust. We need to wake up from it. It teaches us that our cravings are not enemies, they are invitations to look deeper. It teaches us that freedom does not mean the absence of desire, but the absence of slavery to it. And it teaches us, above all, that in each moment, we choose sit beneath a Bodhi tree. The temptations come. The longing stirs. But we, like the Buddha, have a choice. To believe the illusion, or to see through it. To grasp blindly, or to awaken gently. You do not need to escape desire. You need only to understand it. And when you do, you may find that what you were seeking in others was always pointing you back to yourself. That the peace you thought would come from possession arises instead from presence. Lust, by its very nature, is rooted in lack. It does not arise from fullness or peace. It arises from the feeling that something is missing. That there is a hole in the self, an absence of aliveness, an ache of incompleteness, and that if we could just have this person, that touch, that moment, everything inside us would finally be quiet. It is this lie, the lie of completion through possession, that gives lust its seductive power. But it is also the very reason why lust always leads to suffering. Because what begins in lack cannot end in wholeness. When we chase pleasure to escape ourselves, we are building on a foundation of pain, and pain will always find its way back to the surface. The Buddha saw this clearly, not as a moralist, but as a physician of the human mind. He diagnosed the root of suffering, dukkha, as craving. And among all the cravings, sensual craving, khamata, is perhaps the most deeply entrenched, the most socially normalized, and the least questioned. Lust doesn't only promise physical pleasure, it promises validation, belonging, escape, even a kind of brief transcendence. But what it delivers is dependency. The high becomes a need. The pleasure becomes an addiction. And the person, or image, or fantasy, becomes a chain we tie around our own heart. Many people confuse lust with freedom, thinking that to pursue every desire is to live fully. But the truth is, lust narrows the mind. It shrinks our world to a single goal, getting what we want. In that moment, we'll lose our capacity for spacious awareness, for kindness, for ethical clarity. The other becomes an object, not a being. And we, in our grasping, become smaller too. Lust promises liberation, but what it delivers is entrapment. You are no longer choosing, you are chasing. You are not loving, you are hungering. And the more you feed it, the more it grows. Consider this, every act of lust that is not rooted in wisdom creates karma, not just in some cosmic sense, but in your own psyche. The thoughts you entertain, the actions you take in moments of blind craving, shape the architecture of your mind. Every time you reach for lust to soothe discomfort, you are training your nervous system to depend on stimulation instead of stillness. Every time you use another person's body or attention to distract from your own emptiness, you are reinforcing the belief that you are not whole without something outside of you. This is why lust leaves a residue. Not just in memory, but in your energy. It leaves a subtle guilt, a dullness, a sense of disconnection, not only from others, but from your own deeper self. You may experience moments of ecstasy, the thrill of conquest, the intensity of union. But watch what happens after. The silence returns, and often, it feels heavier than before. That's because lust didn't address the root pain. It only masked it. And when the mask slips, as it always does, you are left with the same ache, now buried under another layer of disappointment. This cycle, repeated often enough, can lead to deep emotional numbness. You begin to lose sensitivity. Nothing excites you unless it is extreme. Real connection feels boring. Subtle affection feels insufficient. You begin to live on the edge of sensation, constantly needing more to feel less. This is not a punishment, it's simply the natural consequence of investing your happiness in impermanent, unreliable sources. The Buddha never said that pleasure is wrong. He simply said it is unstable. To build your peace upon it is to build a house on sand. And yet, that is what most of us are taught to do, by culture, by media, even by our own unmet needs. So we keep returning to the same well, not realizing that the water itself is poisoned with longing. What makes lust especially painful is that it always arrives dressed in hope. It pretends to be the solution to loneliness, the balm for our wounds, the spark that will make life vivid again. And so, we open ourselves to it, sometimes with full trust, sometimes with reckless abandon. But inevitably, the illusion breaks. The person disappoints. The moment ends. The fantasy dissolves. and we are left with a dissonance between what we hoped for and what we got. The gap between craving and reality is the birthplace of suffering. But this doesn't mean we should hate lust or fear it. The Buddhist path is not one of repression, but of understanding. Lust hurts us not because it is evil, but because we misunderstand it. We treat it as a path to wholeness when it is only a reflection of our fragmentation. If we could see it clearly, if we could sit with it without acting, inquire into it without indulging, we would begin to unmask it. And what we would find is not an enemy, but a mirror. A mirror showing us the places inside that still believe love must be earned through pleasure. That still confuse being wanted with being worthy. When you look into the eyes of lust and see not temptation but the wounded longing to be held, to be seen, to be safe, that is the moment lust begins to lose its grip. Not through discipline, but through compassion. Not by slamming the door, but by lighting a candle inside. The end of suffering is not found in denying your desires, but in knowing them so deeply that they no longer rule you. And when that happens, something extraordinary is born, not the coldness of renunciation, but the warmth of real freedom. A freedom that can love without clinging, desire without consuming, feel without drowning. A freedom that does not fear beauty, but no longer bows before it. This is what the Buddha offered. Not a life without pleasure, but a heart that is no longer enslaved by it. We are living in an age the Buddha could not have imagined, not because human desire has changed, but because our access to it has exploded beyond anything ancient minds could fathom. Today, we carry within our palms devices that offer an endless stream of stimulation, connection, fantasy, and validation. In seconds, we can summon images that once took lifetimes to paint in the mind. We can swipe through hundreds of faces, open conversations with strangers across the globe, watch stories that spark desire and fuel longing, all before even leaving bed in the morning. Modern life is not just touched by desire. It is engineered for it. This is what makes lust in the 21st century so complex and dangerous. It's no longer the subtle stirring of the senses that arises when two people meet. It is now a flood, curated, commercialized, and commodified. Everything is made to be attractive. Everyone is encouraged to be desirable. The line between real connection and dopamine-triggering imagery blurs more each day. Lust is no longer a personal impulse, it is a global industry. And the result is not liberation, but exhaustion. We are overstimulated, undernourished, and confused about what we actually want. The Buddha taught that the mind is shaped by what it frequently contemplates. In a world where every app, every advertisement, every click is designed to keep us wanting, what are we contemplating? What thoughts are we planting in the soil of our consciousness? What hunger are we feeding, minute by minute, with every scroll, every like, every glance toward a screen? The modern crisis is not that we desire, it is that we are drowning in desire, unable to distinguish between what is real and what is just a projection on the wall of our inner loneliness. Never before has lust been so accessible, so normalized, and so divorced from relationship. In the past, desire often came with some human context, a gaze across the room, a shared history, a sense of responsibility or restraint. But now, it can be entirely solitary. Entire industries profit from this disconnection: pornography, dating apps, algorithmic social feeds, all offering the illusion of intimacy while keeping us at a safe emotional distance. We consume bodies without stories, pleasure without vulnerability, fantasy without consequence. But our hearts, which long for real connection, are not fooled. Deep down, we know something is missing. We know this is not love. And yet, we keep reaching, not because we are weak, but because we are conditioned. Because the brain, once trained by repeated hits of novelty and stimulation, starts to crave it as a baseline. This is how lust, in the modern world, becomes not just a desire but a dependency. You may no longer even feel excitement, just a numb compulsion to check, to scroll, to chase. And when it's not there, you feel anxious. When it is there, you feel empty. This is the paradox of modern desire. Everything is available, and yet nothing truly satisfies. The Buddha warned of this pattern centuries ago. The more you feed craving, the stronger it becomes. Not because the object is wrong, but because the mind is being trained in restlessness. We are not simply desiring, we are becoming desire. And in that becoming, we forget how to rest, how to be still, how to feel whole without reaching outward. To live in this world and not be consumed by it requires deep mindfulness, not as a technique, but as a way of seeing. We must learn to pause and ask ourselves, what am I actually looking for right now? Is it pleasure or connection? Is it escape or presence? Is this impulse coming from a place of love or loneliness? These questions do not come from a moralistic place. They come from a compassionate one. The Buddha did not shame the seeker. He guided them back to themselves. And this guidance is more vital now than ever. Because the world will not stop offering you distractions. It will not stop feeding your impulses. But you can learn to choose differently. Not because you hate desire, but because you love your peace more. Not because you are repressing yourself, but because you are remembering yourself, the deeper you beneath the waves of craving. Imagine this. You open your phone and feel the familiar pull, the need to see, to swipe, to feel something. But instead of acting, you pause. You breathe. You bring awareness to the body. You feel the ache behind a desire. And you sit with it. Not to punish yourself. To understand. To hold your own longing with kindness. In that moment, you are not rejecting the world. You are reclaiming your mind. You are choosing presence over impulse. And that, in a world of endless distraction, is an act of profound spiritual courage. Desire will always exist. But its power over you depends entirely on your awareness of it. When you are unconscious, desire drives you. When you are conscious, desire becomes just another visitor, one you can greet, learn from, and gently release. So no, the Buddha could not have foreseen TikTok, Tinder, or virtual fantasies. But he did see clearly into the human heart, and what he saw then is still true now. That we suffer not because we feel, but because we believe that feeling must be fulfilled. That craving must be answered. But the greatest freedom is not in getting what you want, it is in no longer needing it. Desire often wears the mask of connection. It convinces us that what we're craving is another person, their presence, their touch, their voice. But look closer, and you will see that what we often crave is not the person themselves, but what they awaken in us. We are not falling into a love, we are falling into a longing. And this longing, when shaped by lust, is not for connection, but for sensation. It is not for union, but for escape. That is why so many of our modern relationships begin with intensity and end in silence, because the fire of lust burns bright, but leaves little room for real warmth. The truth is hard to face. Desire can mimic love, but it cannot become it. Because love requires presence, patience, and an openness that lust simply does not have the capacity to hold. Lust seeks to possess. Love seeks to understand. Lust reaches out to fill itself. Love reaches in to offer itself. The two can arrive together, but more often than not, lust comes first, loud and fast, while love is still waiting quietly in the background, unsure if it will be invited in. The Buddha spoke of metta, loving kindness, not as a soft emotion, but as a fierce, liberating force. It is the kind of love that expects nothing in return, that sees the other not as an object of gratification, but as a fellow traveler in this life of impermanence and change. Contrast this with lust, which wants something, your attention, your body, your energy. Lust looks at another and says, "You are what I need to feel alive." Metta looks and says, "I see your suffering, I see your joy, and I wish you well, even if I am not part of your path." This is why true connection is so rare in a world fueled by desire. Because connection requires vulnerability, and lust avoids it. Lust wants to keep things quick, hot, simple. Connection asks us to slow down, to open our hearts, to risk being seen, not just our body, but our fear, our insecurity, our truth. And this is the irony: while lust appears easier, it often leads to more pain. Because when we engage physically without opening emotionally, we wake up feeling more alone, not less. We thought we were getting closeness, but what we got was contact without care, intimacy without empathy, skin without soul. That is not connection. That is a transaction dressed in passion. And it leaves us starving in ways we cannot always name. We wonder why we feel so hollow after, so unsettled. It's because a part of us knows something precious was imitated, but never offered. In Buddhism, connection begins with sati, mindfulness. To connect with another, we must first be present with ourselves. We must learn to sit with our own emotions, our own emptiness, our own longing, and not flee from it. Because when we run from our own discomfort, we turn others into medicine. We use people to soothe our pain. But when we stay, when we meet ourselves fully, something begins to shift. We no longer seek others to complete us. We meet them as companions, not curers. That's when connection becomes possible, not a merging of two incomplete halves, but a meeting of two whole beings. This kind of meeting is sacred. It doesn't always look dramatic or passionate. Sometimes, it's quiet. A shared silence. A kind glance. A steady presence. But it nourishes the heart in ways no fantasy ever could. Ask yourself, how many of your relationships have been built on real connection? How many began with curiosity, with care, with a willingness to see and be seen, rather than the rush of chemistry or the thrill of being desired? And how often have you mistaken the intensity of desire for the depth of love? This is not to blame, but to awaken. We have all been conditioned to chase intensity. We have been told that to burn is to be alive. But there is a deeper warmth waiting, one that does not flare and vanish, but glows steadily over time. That is the warmth of connection. To cultivate this warmth, we must shift the way we look at others. Instead of asking, "What can I get from this person?" ask, "How can I see them clearly?" Instead of leaning in to fulfill our own needs, we lean in to understand theirs. This does not mean self-sacrifice or spiritual bypassing. It means choosing presence over projection, compassion over consumption. When desire arises, and it will, we can pause. We can ask, is this lust or longing to connect? And in that pause, we create space. Space to choose wisely. To honor the heart, our own, and the others. Because at its core, Buddhist wisdom is about this: learning to meet the world and each other, not with grasping, but with grace. Imagine a world where desire was not the fuel of relationships, but where connection was. Where we looked at each other not as answers to our loneliness, but as mirrors of our shared humanity. Where touch was not the end goal, but an expression of trust. Where love was not something we fell into, but something we grew, patiently, mindfully, tenderly. That world is not a fantasy. It is what awaits when we begin to untangle lust from love and let real connection rise in its place. If you try to fight lust, you will lose. Not because it is stronger than you, but because the very act of fighting gives it more life. Lust is not a demon to be slain, nor a stain to be scrubbed out of the soul. It is a fire, and like all fires, it can either burn the house down or warm the heart, depending on how you hold it. The Buddha never asked us to destroy desire. He asked us to understand it. And in that understanding, something beautiful happens. Desire no longer controls you. It becomes a doorway to insight. To begin working with lust, we must first shift our relationship to it. Instead of labeling it as bad or shameful, we approach it with curiosity. We become students of our own longing. When desire arises, whether in the body or the mind, we do not run. We do not chase. We sit. We breathe. We feel. We investigate. What is this sensation in my chest? What thought triggered this? What am I actually hoping to feel if I pursue this impulse? And perhaps most importantly, what am I avoiding by turning toward this craving? Often, lust arises not because we are overwhelmed by beauty or chemistry, but because we are uncomfortable with our own inner silence. We feel bored, lonely, anxious, unloved. And instead of meeting those feelings directly, we reach for desire to distract us. It works, briefly. But the cost is steep. We never learn to sit with ourselves. This is where Buddhist practice becomes essential. Meditation, particularly mindfulness of the body, is one of the most powerful tools for transforming lust. Not by suppressing it, but by feeling it fully. Sit down. Close your eyes. Let the wave of desire arise. Don't act. Don't analyze. Just observe. Watch the sensations, the heat, the restlessness, the pull. You'll notice something profound. Desire is not solid. It moves. It shifts. It grows. It fades. It is not you. It is just a weather pattern passing through consciousness. This is liberation, when you realize you can feel without being ruled by what you feel. You can experience the intensity of lust without collapsing into it. You are not suppressing it, and you are not indulging it. You are resting in the eye of the storm, steady and awake. For some practitioners, working with lust may also include contemplation practices. One traditional approach taught by the Buddha is ashibhavavana, contemplation of the unattractive aspects of the body. This is not meant to breed aversion, but to break the illusion that sensual pleasure is the path to happiness. By contemplating the body, not as a polished image, but as impermanent, aging, full of fluids, subject to decay, we loosen our grasp. We see that the object of lust is not inherently desirable. It is our projection, our fantasy, that turns it into something magnetic. When the fantasy falls away, so does the craving. But this practice must be balanced with compassion. We do not use it to judge others or ourselves. We use it to remind the mind, beauty is fleeting, and our peace cannot depend on what is fleeting. Another powerful tool is metta bhavana, the cultivation of love and kindness. You might not expect this, but metta is an antidote to lust. Because lust objectifies, while metta dignifies. When you feel intense desire for someone, try this, pause, and silently wish them well. May you be happy. May you be free. May you find peace. Notice how the energy shifts. Lust says, I need you. Metta says, I care for you. One clings. The other releases. Of course, this work is not easy. especially in a world that constantly reinforces the opposite. You may fall. You may forget. You may get caught in old patterns. That's okay. The path of working with lust is not a straight line, it's a spiral. You return again and again to awareness, again and again to compassion. And each time, you remember a little sooner. You suffer a little less. What matters most is intention. Are you moving through the world trying to fill a hole inside you, or are you learning to hold that hole with love? Are you using others as tools to escape yourself, or are you learning to meet them from a place of wholeness? Even when you fall into lust, your intention can guide you back. Each craving is a bell ringing in the temple of your practice. Wake up, it says. Look deeper. In time, desire loses its edge. Not because you become cold or numb, but because you are no longer starving. The need to chase fades. The ache to possess dissolves. You become content in your own presence. And from that stillness, love can flow, not the hungry love that grasps and clings, but the mature love that sees clearly and holds gently. To work with lust is not to conquer it. It is to make peace with it. To see it not as the enemy of the spiritual path, but as a part of it, a mirror that shows us where we still believe we are incomplete. And once we see that, we begin to remember the deeper truth the Buddha pointed to, that what you are looking for, you already are. Sometimes the teachings become clearer not through explanation, but through example. Through stories, ancient and modern, of those who have walked through the fire of desire and come out the other side, not burned, but illuminated. These are not tales of saints who never felt lust, but of real beings, monks, lay people, kings, courtesans, who faced craving directly and chose a different path. And in their choosing, they show us what is possible for us too. Let us begin with one of the most well-known figures in the Buddha's life, Angulimala. He was a feared killer, driven by delusion and rage, wearing a garland of fingers. But at his core, he was not evil, he was lost. And when he encountered the Buddha, something in him paused. The Buddha did not fight him. He did not run. He stood calmly and said, "I have stopped, Angulimala. When will you stop?" That one sentence, a call not to suppress violence but to stop running with it, changed everything. Angulimala renounced his past, became a monk, and ultimately attained enlightenment. His story teaches us that no matter how deep the conditioning, how strong the craving, transformation is always possible. But we must stop. We must face ourselves. Then there is the tale of Nul, a former courtesan. In the Thrigatha, the verses of the elder nuns, she recalls how she was once praised for her beauty, desired by many, intoxicated by power. But even then, she says, she felt hollow. Men came to me drunk with lust, and I smiled, knowing they saw only a mask. Eventually, she left that life behind and entered the path of Dhamma. What awakened her wasn't shame, it was weariness. She had tasted every flavor of desire and found them all temporary. What she longed for was stillness, not stimulation. And in the forest monastery, far from perfume and silks, she finally met herself. Her peace did not come from being untouched by lust, but from seeing through its illusions. Even in the Buddha's own story, we see the power of presence in the face of desire. Recall once more the daughters of Mra, Tanha, craving, Arti, aversion, and Ramya, passion, who danced before Siddhartha beneath a Bodhi tree. They tried everything: seduction, shame, flattery, fear. But Siddhartha did not resist them with hatred. He sat. He saw. And their illusions dissolved. That story is not just about one night long ago. It is about every moment we are tempted to reach Halvard for completion. When we choose to remain still, to investigate the craving instead of obeying it, we are practicing the same presence that led Siddhartha to awakening. Modern stories, too, offer wisdom. There is the man who once described how he spent years addicted to online pornography. He said, "At first it was escape. Then it became habit. Then it became who I thought I was. But through mindfulness practice, he began to slow down. At first, just 10 seconds between the urge and the action. Then a minute. Then a choice. He began to feel again, not just pleasure, but grief. Underneath the lust was a deep loneliness, a hunger to be loved. And when he began to sit with that, when he stopped using fantasy to mask pain, he said, for the first time, I felt like a human again. This is not just healing. It is liberation in motion. There are countless such stories, some dramatic, others quiet. The woman who stopped dating compulsively and began walking in nature each morning instead. The teenager who felt consumed by sexual urges but began journaling and found that his deepest longing was not physical but emotional. He wanted to feel seen. The couple who began their relationship with wild chemistry but later learned to talk about their fears, their shadows, their real needs, and in doing so, discovered a deeper, more grounded form of intimacy. These are not tales of perfection. They are proof that awakening does not require you to be pure, it asks you to be honest. The Buddha's teachings were always pragmatic. He did not demand renunciation from everyone. He offered a path to those who wanted freedom. For some, that freedom meant celibacy. For others, it meant learning to relate to desire without being ruled by it. He said, like rain cannot penetrate a well-thatched roof, craving cannot enter a mind that is well-trained. That is the heart of the path, not to kill desire, but to train the mind. To see desire clearly, and from that seeing, choose wisely. We often think of spiritual awakening as a lightning bolt, as sudden, final transformation. But for most, it is a gradual turning. A shift in how we relate to our impulses, our pleasures, our pain. Every moment you notice craving and do not act from it blindly, that is liberation. Every time you meet longing with compassion instead of compulsion, that is the path unfolding. Every time you see a person not as a means to your fulfillment, but as a being worthy of your respect, that is wisdom taking root. So take heart. You are not alone in your struggle with lust. It is part of the human journey. But you are also not powerless. Others have walked this road. They have stumbled, they have stood, and they have walked again, slowly, honestly, bravely. You can too. There comes a moment on the path, not dramatic, not loud, when the fire that once consumed you begins to grow quiet. The craving that used to shake your bones arrives like a whisper now. The image that used to pull you into fantasy barely stirs the surface of your awareness. And in that quiet, something new is heard, something so subtle and so sacred that it cannot be chased, only welcomed, peace. Not the peace that comes after indulgence, not the peace that comes from exhaustion or collapse, but the peace that arises when the storm of wanting has passed, and you realize you are still here. Whole. Unbroken. Already enough. This is the peace beyond pleasure. It is not opposed to pleasure, it simply no longer depends on it. When the Buddha spoke of nidna, he didn't speak of it as a place, or even as a state of mind. He spoke of it as a cessation, the ending of craving, the extinguishing of the fire. And with that extinguishing, comes the most profound relief a human being can know. Not because the world has changed, but because the grip has loosened. The fists of desire have unclenched. The grasping has given way to grace. To reach this peace, You do not need to become someone else. You do not need to cut yourself off from the world or run away to the mountains. You simply need to turn inward, not with shame, but with sincerity. To begin looking at your desires not as enemies, but as messengers. Every craving you have is telling you something, not about what you want, but about what you believe you lack. Listen closely. Beneath the desire for a body is the desire to feel alive. Beneath the desire to be wanted is the desire to be worthy. And beneath the desire to escape is the aching longing to be at home in your own skin. When you can meet these deeper longings without trying to fill them from the outside, you begin to taste the sweetness of inner freedom. A freedom that cannot be seduced, that cannot be sold, that does not vanish when the beauty fades or the attention disappears. This freedom is not glamorous. It is not praised in the world of desire. But it is steady. It is deep. It is real. Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that you are no longer haunted by the ache to be chosen, the restlessness to be touched, the endless searching for something to complete you. Imagine looking at a beautiful person and feeling no need to possess them. Only appreciation. Only presence. Imagine your mind resting, truly resting, for the first time, not because every desire is fulfilled, but because you have seen through the illusion that they ever needed to be. That is peace. It does not mean you feel nothing. It means you feel everything, and yet, nothing binds you. You can love without clinging. You can enjoy without becoming attached. You can experience beauty without becoming lost in it. This is not detachment in the cold sense, it is intimacy without addiction. It is the freedom to engage with life fully, with open hands instead of grasping fists. Many people fear that letting go of lust will make life dull or empty. But it is not lust that gives life its color, it is awareness. When your mind is no longer obsessed with seeking, it becomes available for seeing. You begin to notice things you missed before, the softness of a breeze, the way light falls through a window, the quiet kindness in someone's voice. These were always there, but you were too busy chasing what you thought would bring joy to see the joy already present. This is why the Buddha smiled, not because he had no desire, but because he was no longer driven by it. He could meet each moment as it was, not as he wished it to be. And that meeting, honest, present, awake, is the essence of peace. You too can touch this peace. It does not require you to be perfect. Only willing. Willing to pause, to look, to feel, to inquire, to be with your experience, no matter how raw, without needing to run. Each time you do that, you step off the wheel of craving. You exit the trance. You come home. And when you live from that place, you become a refuge, not just for yourself, but for others. Because in a world burning with longing, nothing is more healing than someone who is at rest. Someone who does not need to impress or seduce or conquer. Someone who can simply be. That is the fruit of this practice. Not denial. Not repression. But presence, ease, and a heart so full it has nothing left to grasp for. So if you have struggled with lust, know this: you are not broken. You are human. And being human means living in a body that longs, a mind that imagines, a heart that hungers. But it also means you have the capacity to wake up, to hold those longings without being held hostage by them, to discover a joy deeper than pleasure, a love deeper than longing, a peace that no craving can disturb. This peace is waiting, not somewhere far away, but within your own awareness. Closer than breath, quieter than thought, already here. All it asks is that you stop chasing and listen. If this teaching touched something deep in you, I invite you to take a moment now, not to scroll away, not to distract, but to sit with your own heart. Feel what's alive in you. Let it speak. And if this message brought clarity or calm, consider sharing it with someone who may be caught in the same cycle. Together, we can remind each other, you don't have to chase what keeps hurting you. There is a wiser way. There is a quieter joy. There is peace, and it's already inside you. If you'd like more content like this, subscribe to Lotus of Dharma and help us continue sharing these timeless Buddhist truths for a modern world.